Hey everyone, my name's Chris, and today we're talking me rather than Kanye West, but Kanye, of course, is gonna get discussed a lot. So Lincoln here, we were in the middle of Lincoln's questions when I had to uh, deal with my puppy. So let's get back to it. Lincoln saying, "What do you think non-Kanye fans should know about Kanye?" I feel like non-Kanye fans just need to know Kanye's a good person, and often the headlines don't do him justice. Like, even if you disagree with the things that he says, I think most of the headlines ignore context, and most of the people are never getting the context of what he says. And still, I think the context often softens what he says. Even if you still disagree with it, you're like, I get a little bit more where he's coming from. But I've seen people try to say, like, Kanye and R. Kelly are just as bad. And it's like, no, they're not. Like, not even in the same ballpark as bad. Like, Kanye's heart's always in the right place. His actions, aside from interrupting Taylor Swift, which I think we can rate as like relatively low on the consequences scale, have always been good. He stood up for against homophobia in hip hop. He called out George Bush. He's always been fighting for people and donating money and giving back in ways that he can behind the scenes rather than making a big deal about it. Like, all in all, Kanye's a good person, and people should know that, even if they dislike the music, even if they dislike some of the things that he says and how he says them. Regarding his recent tweets, what was your initial reaction? Sadness, because I've always liked him and Kim together. I thought that they balanced each other well, and it seemed like they were in love. And what like a great thing in Hollywood, right? And for celebrities to just, and plus their story was so great. Like, Kanye loved her for so many years, leading up to them even getting together. For the fact that you see that falling apart so publicly and so surprisingly, that's it's pretty sad to me, because even if it is like an episode of some kind, right? That's still going to do damage to the relationship. And if it's not an episode and this is just how the relationship is at this point, like, that's sad as well. And that's all. I'm a fan. Please notice me. Noticed, Lincoln. Noticed. Yo, shout out for getting the Yeezus book. That's awesome. I'm glad some people enjoy it or have gotten it and seem to like it. We put a lot of time and effort into that. Joe Masuda, seems like everyone wants the Yandi songs that were on the original track list, but what would be the reason for him to go back to the album he scrapped, especially after he said Jesus Christ did the laundry? I still think my response to like the poems I've written, short stories I've written, is even if they don't get published, even if I like throw them away for a while, there's still something there. Like, I wrote them for a reason. Like, I was going for something, and I even go back and resalvage things. I imagine it's very similar for Kanye, that he still made Yandi and got it to a point where it was close to release. I think he still feels that there's probably something interesting in those songs that he can use, which is why we keep seeing some of them come up again and again. I don't think all of them are going to get used, but it makes sense. That's why he would go back to that album that was scrapped, right? Oh my God. Luke, I've always been curious about that photo that came out about Kanye opening for Tupac and Biggie and whether or not it was real. I mean, I assume it wasn't, but was there any concrete proof for either side? This came up, I think it was like a couple years ago, when Kanye talked about saving the theater in Chicago. That photo was kind of going around that Kanye opened, and I saw somebody say that it was fake, somebody else say it was real. I need a Snopes article about that, which I feel like this is one of those things that the like the hardcore fans that know everything, like the whole history of Kanye, are going to be like, how don't you know this? And it's just one of those things that like I discovered and it was like, that's the facts, and then has completely fallen out of my head. So if any of you can help me and help Luke and help everybody that doesn't know, would be much appreciated. Abbott Nyako, what do you think happened to the Brother song that Kanye recorded? Will we ever see it released? This was actually an article I wrote on Forbes called What Happened to Brothers. I did an interview with Chris Styles, Seven Aurelius, and a bunch of other people that were involved with the creation of the song. So it was a Seven Aurelius song that he then brought to Irv Gotti. Aurelius and Gotti were like a duo back in the day. I forget what the label was called, but they worked hand in hand on a lot of production and were partners, and then had a falling out, and they didn't talk for a long time until Seven really thought that this song was meaningful and he should take it to Irv, and then Irv brought it to Kanye, and they were going to have it be for the premiere of Brothers, right? Not the premiere of Brothers, the premiere of God, I'm even blanking on the show. Whatever show Irv Gotti was doing, that was kind of these like stories, and Brothers was the season 2 original episode and original song. And I guess what happened was Irv got it set up to have Seven like play it for Kanye. They go out to where Kanye was. I think Kanye was talking about like an amusement park and some other things. It was kind of like going into a whole new world being with Kanye, but they played the song for him and Kanye loved it. And Seven got to play it again and Kanye loved it again. He was all about it. And then they used the instrumental aspects of the instrumental for Violent Crimes without really telling anybody, I guess. So there was like some crediting issues with that, and then some issues with like apparently Brothers was going to be on Yandi, so it delayed the song again because it was going to be on the album and then it wasn't going to be on the album. So I'm talking to like lawyers, I'm talking to managers, I'm talking to like all these people to get this story straight. And at the time that I first started the story, they thought it was going to make Yandi and was going to be part of the album. And that's why it wasn't allowed to be released after the show had aired. But then that didn't happen, obviously. And like in the middle of me like writing the story, like the conversation kind of like changed. At first, they seemed ready to like go to war with Kanye, and then they were cool, and then the song just kind of fell off the face of the earth, which is a shame because I think a lot of us really liked the song. So sad all around. So I doubt we'll ever see it released, though Seven was working on a project, and I think he was gonna like, I should look into that. I completely forgot. Yurtis, why do you hate Liftoff so much? I've only hear about this hatred in passing while listening to episodes and never found out exactly what's so wretched about that track. Everything. So when Watch the Throne came out, I was obviously excited as everybody else. I was living in Asheville, North Carolina at the time, and I've been on a huge Kanye kick for the last year. My Beautiful Dark Twisted Fantasy had just been on like repeats. I had a CD in my car, and it was the only CD in my car, and I listened to it everywhere I went. And I lived in Ohio, so I had to drive everywhere to do anything, like 20 minutes. And I just moved down to Asheville, gotten Spotify, like gotten Watch the Throne, and was obsessed with it. And I hear No Church in the Wild, right? And it's so spectacular, such a great opening. And I know the next song's like Beyonce, Jay-Z, Kanye, like what kind of banger is this going to be? And the refrain plays too many times and is so long. Like I get so bored by the refrain. Like I like it once, it's cool the second time, I lose interest the third time, and then the fourth and the fifth time, I just like am sick of it. I don't want to hear it anymore. And then Kanye's verse is like the most pointless and silly verse I've ever heard him. Like it's not substantial or thoughtful, or like what's the point of it? Like it feels like he wrote half of a verse and was just like, I don't feel like finishing it. And then Jay comes in and has some of the, like, it just doesn't make sense to me what he's saying. Like he talks about being better than everybody, but then like everybody's jealous, but then their dick's soft, and then it feels contradictory. The Dale Earnhardt line rubs me the wrong way. It just feels like very insensitive in a way for somebody that like had recently died, and just making like a joke about it. So that was strange. And then he talks about like we're lifting off, and then they do the countdown, or he says like we're lifting off, and then it says we need fuel. Like that's very anticlimactic. Bothers me. just bothers me, man. We just did actually a Patreon episode where I like ranted for 11 minutes about Liftoff. So if you want to hear that and all the passion of that, patreon.com/Kanye podcast. But that's more. I just hate all of it, like every single moment of it, top to bottom. Yeah. Javante Jones, do you think that the party from Bound 2 is the same as the one from I'm In It and Blood on the Leaves? Yeah, that's interesting. I've never really thought about that but no, Blood on the Leaves, though I do think it's a motif, right? Blood on the Leaves, you have the historic party, right? That's kind of a flashback to this time when Kanye or Yeezus and this woman are younger and in love, and she's at her first party and tried her first Molly, and you can feel that this is the innocence that they had before they fell into celebrity and all of the posturing and limelight and consumerism that comes with that, before they were new slaves, right? When there was still kind of a passion about it. So you have that party, which then contrasts Guilt Trip and him being with kind of the girl from I'm In It. I still think the girl at the start of Guilt Trip is the same as the girl on I'm In It, right? And she's just fancy and dancing on the lawn. She's kind of the end result of whoever that girl that got torn by the limelight would become, right? Just another one of these like star fuckers who will do anything to just party and be catered to and given stuff. And he sees her dancing in the lawn. And then Bound 2, you have him going to the club and them going on the airplane. And I don't think it's the same party. I think he's meeting this woman that he thinks he can actually have a relationship with, and it's a restart after he's kind of worked through his emotions on Blood on the Leaves and Guilt Trip and gone back to the club on Send It Up and just kind of looked around at the club and be like, I don't want this life anymore. I don't want these women anymore. So Bound 2 is kind of a progressive step forward. Has Ye inspired your writing? How? That's a good question. You know, when I write, I don't think a lot about Kanye. I'm thinking more about like Don DeLillo, Roberto Bolaño, like all these books that I read. If you saw, like, before we moved, behind me it used to be like a giant shelf of books, like just books on books on books on books on books. If you go back to the earliest videos on the channel, you can see that. But I have something like, I don't know, 500 books, 400 books. Like, it's an insane amount of books that are all on a shelf in the living room. So I'm thinking more so in terms of like literature and poetry, but there is something to Kanye's like narratives and just the energy and vitality that he brings. And I think the daring to keep trying new things in each like work. So my first novel, 10,000 word sentence, my second novel, 52 like short stories or vignettes that all kind of tie together to tell one giant story. So I'm always trying something like new gimmick wise or meta wise in the writing that is kind of a challenge or break from the normal structure, which maybe that comes more from Kanye. Do you agree with Kanye on the simulation? How would you break it? Kind of. I mean, we definitely live in a perceived world, right? I mean, you even look at the basic, like, oh, once you graduate high school, you should go to college, and how much pressure there is on that and how we just accept that. And that's not how things were. That's not how things was. Like, there's a lot of things in the culture that you're in that you don't really realize how specific they are to the culture and not how universal they are. Like, when I went to Australia for the first time, they take long ass vacations. Like, it's just culture there that you work to live rather than live to work. And that's how they would describe America, right? So if you go on a 2-month vacation in Australia, they're just like, good on you, have a great holiday. But then here, you're like, hey, I'm going on a 2-month vacation. They're like, you're fired. Like, you didn't ask for that 2 weeks in advance. It's silly, the work culture here. And then I think some of the expectations that we set, some of the things that we just accept as okay, even look at Kanye and others talking about the 13th Amendment and the loophole for prison work labor. Like, we freak out about, and we don't even freak out about it anymore, but you look at like sweatshops and the idea that like, oh, Nike may have a sweatshop. We have sweatshops all throughout America, and nobody really even questions it because we're trained not to question it. So I do think that there's a lot that we don't perceive or fail to perceive because, like, the frog being the water slowly boiling in the pot and the frog not noticing how hot it's getting. It's kind of like that. We're born into something and we don't really learn to question it until we're older, have an experience that causes us to do that. So I guess I would break it through travel. First and foremost, being able to get outside of your culture, see new cultures, and have that as something you can reflect on and compare and contrast. Because without contrast, you can't see any of the flaws in the system that you're in, or even have it to compare to, see any of the benefits either. Boss, thoughts on Ye wanting Jay-Z as his running mate? I think, of course, he would like a good relationship with Jay and just thinking about one day that they could reunite. But it seems Jay's pretty like over Kanye at this point, which still feels like a shame. You wonder what went on behind the scenes, because even with just like the shooter comments, like don't send shooters at me, or talking about Beyonce, like nothing that Kanye said, at least to me, was that transgressive. Even mentioning Blue Ivy was just like, our daughters haven't played together. Like, he's airing it out, which I can get like, oh, how could he like say it without contacting me? But at the same time, I still don't think it's a bad thing to say. Not enough to where like Jay should never talk to him again or would never talk to him again. But that's kind of been the case. So I do wonder what more has gone on behind the scenes or been said between them or not said that's led to this point. ECR, thoughts on how Kanye changes the narrative of his albums as the track lists develop. Have you ever tried to find one of these other narratives in them? I don't think I've ever... I mean, yeah, kind of. Like with Jesus is King, when the first track list came out, I wrote an article on Forbes.com about like what we could take away from the track list, what perceived narrative, and then he changed it up. And you're just like, okay, now what does this mean? I didn't do it so much with The Life of Pablo, but I think if you look at The Life of Pablo, you see the anchor points, right? Father Stretch My Hands and Famous were always at the top of the album, and FML, Real Friends, and Wolves were always at the bottom of the album. So what was really changing was just the amount of time spent in the middle of the album, and it seems like in some of those versions, things happen a little faster and then we get to the end, but it's still that same story of I am in a complicated place where I'm torn between ego and vulnerability, and ending with vulnerability winning out, with ego in FML being thrown to the side because you know that if you don't get rid of it, you're going to lose your lady. So you got to do this for your lady. So I like discovering that, like, what were the anchor points in this, or what can you see was kind of the common thread that he was trying to like get at or develop. I know even with the novels that I've created, there were chapter switches or poems. Like, it's one of the things where you can write like 5 stanzas and be like, this isn't working. And then you take the last stanza and move it to the top and it works perfectly. So I do think often the track list changing is just kind of finding what's the proper feel. But for so many of the songs, I never hear the actual content on them. So the track list changing doesn't matter all that much. But even on like Yay, I think Ecstasy was in the place of Yikes at first. And I think they're carrying that same energy, right? Yikes, as we see in the end product, is about Kanye ramping up, and that tension between him saying like, this is frightening, like find help, looking at himself, which is kind of relevant right now, I think, because if it is some kind of episode, you can see how powerless in that song that he feels as the ramped up state takes over, right? And he's just sitting there as an observer being like, this is menacing and frightening when this happens. Like, that's how this reflective part of me feels and can comment on, even though the active part of me is starting to really like thrive on this sense of power that I have. And by the end, that sense of power takes over the song. With Ecstasy, you don't get that dynamic explicitly the way that you get on Yikes, but it's still such an outrageous track, right? It's still an outrageous track that shows kind of the ramped up state. I was thinking, is it All Mine that it was going to replace? But either way, it still fits that idea. Like, it wasn't Violent Crimes replaced Ecstasy. It wasn't Would It Leave replaced Ecstasy. It's in that second or third slot where the whole point is to show the ego and mania and the wackiness of that, or just the absurdity of it. So like Ecstasy's lines about like, I have these sisters-in-law that I would sleep with, it's jarring, but it's supposed to be jarring because it's supposed to capture that energy where we're just like, oh my. What else do we got? We got Finton, favorite non-Kanye albums. I really love 10,000 Days by Tool, American Idiot by Green Day, Black Star, Mos Def and Kweli, and what else is there? Wish You Were Here by Pink Floyd, and Believe by Disturbed is also one of my favorites. So I think that would round out kind of some of the top 5 non-Kanye albums. Let's just take a second, Mason here, and respect Dave Chappelle for supporting Kanye. Yeah, Dave Chappelle flying out from Ohio to Wyoming just like the morning after Kanye's tweets, like definitely a real one for that. Like those two have known each other since Kanye first appeared on the Chappelle Show back in like 2003, 2004. Bound 2, can we ask questions about you? Where can I get your book? Book is available on kingshotpress.com, both Killer and Victim and Killer Unconquered, and Amazon. Killer and Victim is Killer space ampersand Victim. So the and Victim are kind of together. And then Killer Unconquered is the other one. Favorite books of all time. 2666 by Roberto Bolaño. Catch-22 by Joseph Heller. Cosmopolis by Don DeLillo is another one, and a big one as an influence. Infinite Jest, as pretentious as that is to say, is another one. And Cormac McCarthy's Blood Meridian and Malcolm Lowry's Under the Volcano is another big one. All very dense and weird books. Advice for getting started with writing. I think the big thing with writing is understanding that first drafts don't have to be perfect, and that the actual first draft often sucks in any artistic field. Maybe not filmmaking, because you have to be so perfect with that, but even with filmmaking, most of the film comes together in the editing room, right? Rather than just it's shot cleanly and perfectly right away. So I think that's kind of the biggest tip. I was just talking with somebody the other day that said that they hadn't written in a while because they feel this pressure to really make sure everything that they write says something and has meaning, which I get having that sense about it. But really, so much of writing is working through and practicing things and honing your craft that you just write knowing that a lot of things are going to be shitty or start in a place that isn't meaningful. But as you think about it, as you work through it, you hone your craft to the point where you get better at saying what you want to say and saying something meaningful. And that a lot of the time you discover what that is as you're writing. So it's okay to go into a project with just a feeling, with just kind of a concept in mind or a single idea in mind that you just start trying to figure out. Like you want to write a story where you just hear somebody tapping on a window. And that could be the only thing that you have. You start trying to write it and it's not working, but then you at least can start to point out like, why isn't this working? Okay, I don't have a good setup, or the character's not right. Let me get back into that. Let me figure that out. So much of writing is just problem solving. And then you write and see if you solve the problems and then go back and improve the writing and get it to where you want. So I think don't be scared of iteration and making mistakes and erasing and starting over. The first novel that I wrote, Killer and Victim, I wrote 100,000 words of that book, and when I went back to it after a couple years of working on other things and thinking through, because it wasn't working, but I had all the stuff I wanted to say, I tore it down to 7,000 words. That's it. And from 100,000 down to 7,000. And then I built it back up to 50,000 with all new content. The same idea was there, but it did shift in ways. But the idea of this serial killer that has a shifting personality based on just the things that are said to him or around him, and he embodies different characters. He's a little schizophrenic in that way, but also performative in that way, which is, I don't know, fascinating to me. But I took that idea and some of the scenes from it and just turned it into something completely new. And when I wrote Killer Unconquered, which is a sequel, I used still a lot of characters and ideas from the 93,000 words that were cut, but it was 100% new work. Like, I don't think I used 100 words from it. I used some character names, and I had this concept of like the 52 card cab company. But even looking back at the writing, I was like, no, I'll just start fresh, and went back and built it up. And it goes in a different direction than what I initially expected, but it still gets at the same key components and matters that I was going to examine and look at. And it still plays into the third book the exact way that I wanted it to. So yeah, don't be afraid to have just drafts and to write even though you don't know where it's going. Let's see if you said anything else here. And let's see if Kanye said anything. Kanye? Did you say anything? No. Okay. And no. Okay. Keyblade again. Do you think orange has anything to do with Kanye music? Think about how he said he spilled orange juice. Him and Elon were wearing orange, and he recently pointed out 88 Manop were both wearing orange. Or is it that just a running joke? Yeah, I don't know. Like, all the sheets of paper for the Donda release were orange, right? For the track list. And then they had oranges on their shirts, him and Elon, and he talked about spilling the orange juice. I have no idea where that's coming from. If it's just an aesthetic that he's on and just feeling like orange is empowering and he wants like more orange in his life, or there was actually something there to that. But I'm going to say right now, inside joke regarding something, but I don't know if it's album related at this point. Jackson, fave Ye feature, and why is it American Boy? Yeah, I think it's American Boy. You know, I've always been on the boat that I don't like Kanye's features as much as his album songs, because I think his features, he tends to just be a little bit more like jokey, braggadocio, and not as narrative or deep as I prefer, which is fine. It's like good to have both. It's just my sensibilities tend to not like both and prefer one way more than the other. But American Boy, I always really just resonated with what he was doing. That extended verse, it felt much more like on to a purpose of content rather than just falling into some of the classic braggadocio tropes. And Run This Town. Run This Town's also fantastic. Like, he definitely outshines Jay-Z on that track. So that's another one that's up there for me. Jefferson Tom, why do you think it's acceptable to call yourself a Kanye fan and have no interest in listening to Yandhi? You weird, bro. Yeah, that's one of those things where I just don't necessarily get as hyped for unfinished tracks. And I know some of them are more finished than others. And I have listened to a lot of them, but I tend to always wanted to wait for the finished stuff, or just like knowing where the artist goes with it. I never really liked it with deleted scenes in movies either, or like lost chapters in books or things like that. Something that's unofficial or not part of what the main story was, usually I'm just not into, which seems to be like universal and not just Yandhi related, right? So that's more of just me. Jun Kim, who are Kanye's real friends in your opinion? I guess right now is showing a lot of people with just the fact that like Dame Dash went all the way out there to be with Kanye, and like I don't know how long they were, like, if there was a gap where they weren't very close, but it feels like over the last few years, Dame has been there for Kanye over and over, even when others have distanced themselves, even when others have uh, argued with him very publicly. Like, you look at John Legend, they got in that one little spat, and you haven't really seen them together since. And even in recent interviews, Legend's kind of put distance between them. He hasn't been mean, but distance. Same thing with Jay-Z. I know Dame, he's is the father of Stacey Dash, right? And she tends to be like much more conservative. So it might just be like Kanye, like he's not upset by the things Kanye is saying because they're on the same page, but they're at least like there for each other, right? And GLC was on the Van Lathan show. I don't know if he made it out to Wyoming. Like, I haven't seen. He talked about how he was hopping on the plane. He had his ticket booked. He was going out to Wyoming, and that was like Sunday. And I haven't seen any photos of him being there, though I'm sure we haven't seen photos of everyone who's there. Chappelle definitely heading out there is a real one, and I'm sure that there are others around, like Sci-Hi, Tony Williams, just a lot of the OGs that are just behind the scenes and there through thick and thin. I mean, Tony's his cousin, so I feel like Tony just knows Kanye and is gonna ride. RG Jordy, do you think Kanye needs to go get medical help? Do you think the media is right to portray him as mentally unstable? I don't think the media knows how to talk about mental health in a way that is good for anybody, because they either go full tilt into it and use it to like dismiss anything that the person says, or they ignore it completely and just judge the person as though they were saying this from like the most logical place that they could think of saying it from, which neither is good to me. And it's not to say that isn't a time or place for one or the other. I just think that there's probably a middle ground that the media has not in any way, shape, or form approached or started to master, much less master and know how to do it. Do I think Kanye needs to get medical help? I would say when you have a diagnosis like Kanye's, that you probably are in, you could probably use care more often than not in some capacity, whatever that may be. Whether that's like an actual intervention from a doctor to just like regularly getting checkups to like meditations or massages or anything that relaxes you that falls under the idea of like medical help. So that's probably a little bit of a cop out based on just like a yes or no of, is this something to be attended? But I'm not there. Like, if this really is the dissolution of his relationship, of course emotions are going to be high, and Kanye being frustrated and upset and acting outside of himself is to be like, that's par for the course, right? So how do you differentiate that and how any of us would kind of get emotional in a similar situation versus like a mental health episode, right? So I don't know enough to say it's one or the other. Jorge Villatoro, this is Evan. I think he has worked a lot. Yeah, Evax. So we were talking about this the other day. Evan, who is listed on the Donda track list, and Evan Mast, it said. Or no. Evan Fix, something. But Evan Mast is his name, and Evax is what he goes under. Evan Kit, that's what it was. Might refer to his contribution to the track or a new addition to the track. Thank you for the info. That's good. And you can see the Evax link here. Efren Enriquez, how do you think Kanye will be viewed 50 years from now? Do you think people will fail to mention him next to names like Stevie Wonder, Michael Jackson, David Bowie, the Beatles, simply because he's a hip hop artist? I feel like by the time our generation is old, like 50 years from now, hip hop's just going to be such like part of music culture at that point. It's kind of like Elvis back in the day was like not considered by the older people of his time to be like a classic, and it was that generation that grew up with him that brought him up to that classic status. And I think the same way that the current generations brought up Bowie and the Beatles and Michael Jackson, those older generations, it's going to be like us, everybody in the like 10 to 40 range that's going to be championing Kanye in the next 50 years, right? So I think he will get mentioned because his discography, to me at least, and I think it's proven true so far, is just going to age better over time and going to get more acclaim over time. Every album that he's released, I think that's been true for. So I think it's only going to continue to be true as he ages and as kind of the controversies die out, just because Kanye's getting older, maybe not in the public space as much, people are going to focus more on the music and start to mythologize him in that way. And once the mythologizing starts, that's when you really see that next level of appreciation, because it goes beyond what we have to do these days, or what a lot of people have to do these days, of trying to separate art from the artist, right? It's just the art becomes the artist in a lot of ways. When we think about Beethoven, we know some details about Beethoven, but most people just think about his art. Same with Mozart, same with Dali, same with Picasso. You learn some facts about them, but it's more the mythology than who they were and the controversies of their time. Even with people like the Beatles had controversy at the time and judgments and criticisms, but now we just think about the Beatles. So I think it'll probably be like that. Daniel, do you think one of Kanye's biggest achievement is that he made Nicki Minaj sound good on Monster? I don't know if it's biggest achievement, but Nicki sounded great on Monster, right? Which her verse to this day I still love and think is fantastic. Yeah, I mean, she's still considered one of the like biggest hip hop artists of the decade, and one of the most prominent and recognized female hip hop artists, absolutely, of all time. So Nicki can stand on her own very well, but I do think that there's something very unique about her verse on Monster that maybe hasn't been replicated in a lot of ways, but I think the same could be said, weirdly enough, for Jay. And I know a lot of people don't like Jay's verse on Monster. I love Jay's verse on Monster. So Dan Queensbridge. Okay, we're almost done. Hey, Chris, I would like to ask you if you've read any Henry Miller. I have not read any Henry Miller. I have one, but I haven't read. I was thinking about a book I haven't read in years. The title of the book, Big Sur and Oranges of Hieronymus Bosch, by Henry Miller. It was Henry Miller's years spent in Big Sur, Cali. If I remember correctly, there's a quote. I feel like they made a movie about that starring Daniel Radcliffe. There's a quote by H.M. in the book where he says something like, if you're an artist, then claim to be the best artist and you are the greatest. Claim to be the best artist and you are the great artist. I'm fucking up the quotes. I think about that book, and Henry Miller's characters in that book very much reminds me of Kanye. Your thoughts? Yeah, I've heard great things about Henry Miller. And that idea of claiming to be the best artist and just like believing it and having that confidence, I think carries a lot of ways, because you'll act in ways you wouldn't act, which makes me think of, this is a weird comparison, I guess, Henry Miller to the movie Collateral. But there's a movie called Collateral with Jamie Foxx and Tom Cruise, where Jamie Foxx is a taxi driver and Tom Cruise is an assassin. And it's essentially like Tom Cruise is forcing Jamie Foxx to drive him around all these places. And at one point, Jamie Foxx has to go in and act in a way that isn't like him. But because he's kind of channeling Tom Cruise and what he's seen from Tom Cruise, there's just this leveling up of what he's able to do and how he carries himself that's very like, oh shit. I like that movie. But that kind of reminds me of this idea, like, you limit yourself when you think, I'm not this thing, I'm not this person. But when you start to embrace the idea that you can be this thing, that you are this thing, it changes the opportunities you allow yourself and the way that you carry yourself. So yeah, that sounds great. Tercio, hey, have no idea what to ask. LOL. Cheers, I guess. Yeah, that's okay. Cheers to you as well. I hope you've been doing well. And I guess that does it for all of the comments. I thank you all for the comments. I hope this was more enjoyable than frustrating for those of you that watch it. But if you watch 40 minutes of me just answering questions, You're a dear. We'll do one of these again at some point, maybe after Donda comes out, and see how it goes. But until next time, stay wavy, keep it loopy, and cheers, y'all. I appreciate you taking the time to ask. Bye.